Hello, welcome to Philbits, where we explore specific themes, arguments, and ideas in the history of philosophy. Philbits is brought to you by philosophytoyou.com. My name is Dr. Todd Mei, and in this episode, we'll be exploring the question, what is philosophical hermeneutics? It's the second of two episodes aimed at introducing the subfield of philosophy concerned with what interpretation is and how interpretation shapes the way we live our lives. In the previous episode, we discussed hermeneutics in terms of the interpretation of text and messages. In this episode, we'll be focusing more on the philosophical development of hermeneutics in the mid to late 20th century. First, a bit of history. For those of you familiar with hermeneutics, you may have asked, well, what about the biblical tradition of hermeneutics? So let's look at three key developments in the history of hermeneutics in outline form. Hermeneutics in the West started with biblical interpretation, particularly with the early church fathers and the so-called fourfold hermeneutic for understanding how to interpret scripture. For example, there was Clement of Alexandria, Ignatius of Antioch, Irenaeus of Lyon, and Origen of Alexandria, who held to the idea that there are four levels in which you can interpret scripture. There is literal meaning, allegorical meaning, moral meaning, and anagogical or spiritual meaning. While I can't go into these four levels in any detail, it does give an indication of how sophisticated the early church fathers were in trying to understand scripture. For example, today, with a lot of the religious controversy that concerns interpretation of religious scripture, we tend to focus on whether or not the literal meaning of such scripture is the true meaning. Looking at the fourfold hermeneutic developed by the early church fathers, it is quite clear that the literal is but one level of understanding that leads to higher, more sophisticated levels of understanding. In the 18th and 19th century, Friedrich Schleiermacher is considered the father of modern hermeneutics, where the understanding of text in general becomes the focus. As we saw in the previous episode, there are different ways in which we can read passages or understand what someone says that can lead to a conflict in meaning. Schleiermacher was concerned with the way we can interpret texts with some kind of method or approach to ensure a degree of accuracy or fidelity to the original text. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Wilhelm Dilthey is known for his romantic hermeneutics, which focuses on understanding the psychological life of the author through the explanation of texts. This approach tends not to be taken too seriously today, with concerns about how we might reduce the understanding of texts and their meaning to a psychological interpretation. But Dilthey's most important contribution to the history of Western philosophy is his distinction between a human scientific approach and a natural scientific approach. While the methods of the natural sciences are well known to us, Dilthey was concerned that the specifically human domain of life had its own method and approach to understanding what was going on. Hermeneutics in the 20th century takes this momentum and develops it in more detail. There are three historical figures who are often identified with philosophical hermeneutics. The first is the German philosopher Martin Heidegger. The second is another German philosopher named Hans-Georg Gadamer. And the third is a French philosopher named Paul Ricoeur. And while philosophical hermeneutics is itself a vast territory, I'm going to identify three ideas or themes that I think will help us understand why hermeneutics matters today. The first is called Thrownness, which is developed by Heidegger. The second, also developed by Heidegger, but explained in a little bit more detail by Hans-Georg Gadamer, is the idea of prejudice. And the third is the idea of listening, which both Gadamer and Ricoeur think are extremely important in understanding how we get along with other people in a highly complex social and political world. Heidegger writes in his magnum opus called Being in Time, "Thrownness is the mode of being of a being, that is the human being, which always is itself its possibilities in such a way that it understands itself in them and in terms of them." In a nutshell, Thrownness is the idea of a pre-existing context into which we arrive. So we don't choose the family we're born into, the time, the history, or the geographical location. Those all form around us, and we are, as it were, inserted into our existence. And all these pre-existing values, ideas, and practices are what define the framework of our understanding. So that framework reflects back to us this notion of the possibilities of our existence. How I see my life going in the 20th century in California is going to be very different from how I see my life going in the 17th century in London. So I always see myself in terms of these kinds of environmental contextual factors that reflect back to me my own capabilities, my own goals, and my desires. Now let's look at the second quote from Hans-Georg Gadamer. There is always already a world already interpreted, already organized in its basic relations, into which experience steps as something new. One way to think about what Gadamer is talking about, and Heidegger, is this idea in literature called in medias res. In medias res is a Latin phrase that signals the way in which certain texts and stories begin. They often begin in the middle of things, or in medias res. Let's look at an example of a Shakespeare play to get a better sense of this notion of a world already in progress that we're inserted into. In the Shakespeare play Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare writes in the prologue, "Two households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona, where we lay our scene, from ancient grudge break to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. From forth the fatal loins of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life." Some interesting things that we can take away from the few lines of the prologue from Romeo and Juliet are not only the historical and geographical location that set the play. In other words, those are factors that Romeo and Juliet are inserted into and define their possibilities, but we get a lot of other things that are coming to us. One is this very interesting phrase that Shakespeare uses called the ancient grudge. In other plays, he refers to an ancient mouse, and this often sets the scenes for a lot of tragedies. In other words, there's some kind of existing relationship between people, a very dysfunctional one, that's going to condition or determine what's going to happen in the play. This ancient grudge between the two competing families is, of course, going to drive the tension of the tragedy of Romeo and Juliet. So these are the kinds of things, this situation of arriving on the scene where things are already in progress or in medias res, is what Heidegger and Gadamer want to capture by this notion of Thrownness, being inserted into a world that already exists, where there's certain relations, values, ideas, and practices that are ongoing, that we inherit, that we adopt, and that we adapt in order to live our lives and figure out what we want to do. So that may seem a little bit bleak. We're inserted into a world and all these relations that determine us or condition us in some way. But that's just the foundation that Heidegger and Gadamer want to use to set up a more interesting and more dynamic way of understanding what's going on with human existence. So let's look at the second of our three concepts, prejudice, or what Heidegger often refers to in Being and Time as pre-understanding. Heidegger writes, "Only support of familiar and common understanding makes possible the venture into the alien, the lifting up of something out of the alien, and thus the broadening and enrichment of our own experience of the world." So while we're inserted into this world of already existing relations, and we might feel that it determines us in some way, Heidegger wants to note that it's only with that given context, which provides us with familiar ideas and relations, in other words, it acts as a resource, it's only by virtue of that we can be self-critical, that we can reflect, that we can decide what needs to be kept, what needs to be changed, or what needs to be retrieved. Maybe we have decided before as a community that we got rid of something, and we decide later that it's a good idea that we might want to bring that back, even if we revise it or reinterpret it in some way. So it's only by virtue of having some kind of resource of the familiar that we can venture into the unfamiliar and the alien, as he puts it. Let's look at the quote from Ricoeur. Ricoeur writes, "The choice in favor of meaning is the most general presupposition of any hermeneutics." There are two things that we can take away from this passage from Ricoeur. The first is at a foundational level. Ricoeur wants to say that the nature of human existence is to affirm itself. That is, life wants to affirm itself, or life is self-affirming. So all the things that we do and we say link to small and large projects that want to accomplish or affirm the things that we take to be meaningful, that we value, or that we desire and believe in. The second idea is sort of the flip side. It's from the point of view of the audience, the receiver, or the reader. And it's the notion that when we encounter what people say or what people do, we can't presume to understand what it might necessarily mean. In other words, that we assume that it's meaningful, but we might not yet understand what the full meaning or import of the action or the text or the message is. So the idea of prejudice in this general sense is to note that what is familiar might be a restriction in some sense, but it also is the doorway or the opening by which we can encounter new things. So prejudice, in other words, for philosophical hermeneutics, is not a pejorative term. It's there to describe a pre-understanding or a bias or the nature of human existence that's limited in some way, but the very nature of that limitation is to open up onto new relations and understandings. Of course, it's not a given, it's not a guaranteed, it's something that we note as a positive. And so the other aspect of philosophical hermeneutics that I'm going to talk about in the third concept of listening is to try and develop this prejudice into a virtue so it can make us open to encountering other experiences and other people. But before turning to listening, let's look at an example of prejudice, bias, and pre-understanding. The US Dust Bowl from 1930 to 1936. According to Farm Aid, the Dust Bowl wreaked havoc on the farm population of the High Plains, where some of the world's most fertile soils lay beneath enormous swaths of grassland. In a matter of decades, the rich prairie topsoil that took millennia to form was lost under mechanical plows and a failure to steward the soil from harvest to harvest. So how might this historical example demonstrate prejudice? Perhaps if farmers were aware of hermeneutic methods and concerns, they would have been more attentive to introducing their familiar methods of farming into a different land with a unique environment. Maybe they would have been observant of the animals like the prairie dog that contribute significantly to the renewal of the prairie environment. In turning to the concept of listening, it may seem like a bit of a cliche that philosophical hermeneutics is just suggesting really that we keep an open mind and listen to those who speak or write to us. Yes and no. They do want to emphasize the importance of listening and understanding, but they also want to develop it in such a way that it opens onto specific regional practices according to any kind of situation, domain, institution, or practice in which you may find yourself. Gadamer writes, "The hermeneutical experience has its own rigor, that of uninterrupted listening." How often do you find yourself in a situation where you have every intention and desire to listen to the person with whom you're having a disagreement or discussion, and the first words come out of their mouth and you have this gut reaction and you start to say, no, yes, but, or you interrupt them and you want to get your point across? Gadamer is trying to make the observation that understanding can't occur without first entirely listening to the story or the account or the testimony of the person with whom you're engaging. A historical example which brings this out quite well is the idea of scholastic debate in the Middle Ages. So in formal debate situations, you could not actually have an argument with an interlocutor until you could explain their position to their satisfaction. And it makes perfect sense, because why would you argue with someone if you actually didn't understand their position? So uninterrupted listening is this idea of letting the other person speak and give the entire account of what they're trying to say before you can engage or ask questions. Ricoeur writes, "There is a mode of non-ethical understanding that is implicit in hearkening and in silence, of paying attention." A very interesting passage from Ricoeur, and I think one of the things that he's trying to bring our attention to is that there is this passive state of listening that doesn't have any kind of ethical value or any kind of ethical intention behind it. In other words, in order to actually form a kind of an evaluative or ethical judgment or come to an ethical position, we must first engage in this passive listening that is open to the things around us. Ricoeur is talking about conversation with people, but he's also talking about the way in which things unfold around us. For example, the way in which the natural environment might be disclosing itself to us. So to go back to the historical example about the Dust Bowl, Ricoeur might say something like, if the farmers at that time had hearkened or listened to or paid attention in this passive, non-ethical mode of listening, they might have been able to take in certain factors that would have clued them into changing their farming practices. So there we have three key ideas for philosophical hermeneutics. We're thrown into existence. We have conceptual prejudices which limit our understanding, but also open us up to alien or unfamiliar experiences. And in order to engage with these possibilities of our existence, we must be able to fundamentally listen to things that are disclosed to us in the natural environment or that are being said to us or written to us by those around us. Before coming to a close, I just want to turn to one practical suggestion, and it comes under the philosophical hermeneutical maxim, explain more in order to understand better. Now, there are many methods of explanation which can help us understand things more accurately, more correctly, or more faithfully. But particularly in relation to the practice of listening, I want to suggest one particular method that you might want to follow next time you're in a heated or intriguing discussion with another person. And that is simply posing 3 questions. And it's the same type of question, it just might be 3 different questions. And the type of question I'm thinking about is not the inflammatory, accusatory, or undermining question when you're having a disagreement. I think we all know those kinds of questions. You pretend to ask a question or inquire about the position of another person, but really you're accusing them of having some kind of false or ropey idea. No, the kind of question I'm thinking about is the explanatory question. In other words, you ask a question that will help you clarify better the idea or position your interlocutor is coming from. So next time you're in a heated discussion, try asking 3 of these explanatory questions to help you understand the position of another person. It works, and in fact, expert negotiators often use the question, or this explanatory question, as one of the first methods of engaging in a hard negotiation. Why? Because the explanatory question actually helps both people come to a more common ground on which they can come to some kind of agreement, ideally. That's all the time we have for the question, what is philosophical hermeneutics? I hope it's been short and sweet. And if you have enjoyed it, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe to this YouTube channel. My name is Dr. Todd Mei. This has been Philbits, brought to you by philosophy2u.com, and I hope to see you next time.